In the final years before the Second World War consumed the Pacific, Japan dreamed of a weapon so powerful that it could alter the balance of the oceans themselves. Its name would become legend: Yamato, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the last and greatest battleship ever built by human hands. This was no mere warship. It was an empire forged into steel. The concept of the super battleship was born from anxiety, not arrogance. Japanese admirals understood the numbers. They could never match American shipbuilding output. But they believed that superiority could be achieved not in quantity, but in dominance. One ship, they argued, could embody the power of 3, a floating fortress capable of destroying any opponent before the enemy could even reach firing range. And so, in absolute secrecy, construction began. Behind wooden barriers and under the eyes of military police, the behemoth took shape in the Kure naval arsenal. Workers swore oaths of silence. Neighbourhoods around the yard were screened off. Even the trees nearby were cut down so that no outsider might glimpse her growing hull. Every rivet, every steel plate was a national secret. The Japanese public didn't even know she existed. By the time the world first learned her name, Yamato was already the most formidable warship ever conceived. She stretched 263 meters from bow to stern, her armoured belt thicker than any bullet or shell designed to penetrate it. Her 9 colossal 46-centimeter guns, the largest naval weapons ever mounted on a ship, could fire shells that weighed more than a small car, arcing through the air over 40 kilometers. Each salvo unleashed 13 tons of steel and fire. Every system aboard her, propulsion, radar, damage control, represented the peak of Japan's industrial capability. Her very presence was a statement. Japan would not yield the seas, but behind the grandeur, the cracks were already forming. The Yamato was a monument to an era that was ending even as she was born. While Japan poured its dwindling resources into steel and armour, the United States was investing in air power, the new language of modern war. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, were rewriting naval strategy across the world's oceans. The admirals who worshipped the battleship refused to see it. In their minds, naval power was measured in armour thickness, not altitude. When Yamato was commissioned in December 1941, the Pacific War had just ignited with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself took her as his flagship, even though he privately doubted the wisdom of building her at all. He understood that the age of the battleship was fading, yet standing on her bridge, with the imperial flag rippling over steel decks the size of city blocks, even Yamamoto could not escape her allure. She was power incarnate. For her first years of war, Yamato was a sleeping giant. Her size made her a logistical nightmare, too massive for most docks, too valuable to risk in battle. She spent much of 1942 and 1943 anchored in distant lagoons, serving as a floating headquarters as the war turned against Japan. Fuel shortages kept her idle. Air raids made movement perilous. The Imperial Navy still waited for the mythical decisive battle, that one final confrontation where Japan's battleships would crush the American fleet in close combat. But the battle never came. The ocean had changed. When she finally sailed into battle, the world she was built for no longer existed. October 1944, the Philippines, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in human history. For the first and last time, Yamato's massive guns spoke in anger. The ocean shook as her 18-inch shells thundered toward American escort carriers. She fired at ships so small that her rangefinders could barely detect them, and yet, in that chaos, her enormous strength proved meaningless. American destroyers charged her formation at suicidal range, launching torpedoes and smoke screens with reckless defiance. It was not the power of her guns that decided the battle, but the speed, coordination, and air dominance of the American fleet. Her sister ship Musashi was sunk before her eyes, hit by wave after wave of aircraft until the sea itself swallowed her whole. When the battle ended, Japan had lost most of its naval strength. Yamato survived, but her survival was hollow. She had fired the largest guns ever built and achieved nothing. By the winter of 1945, the Imperial Navy was a shadow. The carriers were gone. The airfields were ashes. American submarines prowled the home waters freely, cutting Japan's supply lines to ribbons. Yamato, once a symbol of dominance, became a prisoner of her own size. She was too heavy to move, too precious to waste, too outdated to matter. Still, she endured. In dockyards stripped bare by bombing raids, workers swarmed over her decks, adding anti-aircraft guns by the dozens, doomed attempts to shield her from an enemy that ruled the sky. By January, she carried more than 150 of these weapons, filling every open space with black steel barrels. It made no difference. Everyone aboard knew it was an act of desperation. Then came Okinawa, the final stepping stone before the invasion of Japan itself, the battle that would decide everything. When Emperor Hirohito asked what the Navy was doing to defend the homeland, the admirals had no answer. Their fleets were gone, their air wings shattered. In shame, they proposed an operation that defied logic, but appealed to pride, a final suicidal gesture to prove that the Navy still had spirit. Operation Tengo. Yamato, the greatest battleship ever built, would lead a one-way mission to Okinawa. She would sail with a handful of destroyers, strike the American fleet, and then deliberately beach herself on the island's shores to serve as an immovable fortress. Her crew would fight to the death as coastal artillery. There was not enough fuel for a return voyage, and everyone knew it. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding the Second Fleet, called the plan what it was, a death sentence. He argued that sending 3,000 men and Japan's last battleship to certain destruction was madness. But in Tokyo the order stood. The Emperor's question had to be answered. And so, on April 6, 1945, as the sun dipped below the mountains of the inland sea, Yamato raised anchor for the final time. Her fuel tanks held enough oil for a single journey south. Her guns were loaded, her crew assembled. No one spoke of return. As the engines rumbled to life, men on deck bowed toward the homeland fading behind them. The waves shimmered like molten glass in the setting sun. They sailed not toward victory, but toward destiny. Ahead lay Okinawa and the end of an age. The morning of April 7th, 1945 rose grey and heavy over the East China Sea. Low clouds drifted like ghosts, the sea shifting under a restless wind. On the bridge of Yamato, Captain Kosaku Aruga stood in silence, his hands clasped behind his back as the great ship cut through the waves. The engines thrummed deep beneath the steel, 12 boilers driving the heaviest warship in history toward her final horizon. Every man aboard understood what this voyage meant. There would be no return. The crew had been told their mission was to defend Okinawa, but they knew the truth. The ship carried just enough fuel to reach the island, none to come home. It was a gesture of defiance, a sword raised toward the inevitable, and yet discipline held. In the mess decks, sailors ate their rice quietly. Gun crews checked ammunition belts one last time. The youngest recruits wrote letters they would never send. Some folded family photos into the lining of their uniforms. Honour demanded silence, not protest. At 6 a.m., a formation of 6 Japanese Zero fighters appeared overhead, the only air cover Yamato would ever have. They circled briefly before fading northward, their engines dwindling to nothing. From that moment onward, the fleet was alone. The escorting light cruiser Yahagi led the formation, followed by 8 destroyers guarding Yamato's flanks. From the air, they must have looked like a spearhead driving into the void. What they didn't know was that American submarines had already found them. Hours earlier, USS Threadfin and USS Hackleback had sighted the Japanese formation and begun trailing it, transmitting constant updates. American carriers hundreds of miles away received the coordinates in real time. In the sky, reconnaissance aircraft began to converge, invisible watchers circling far beyond gun range. By mid-morning, Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, had already made his decision. The greatest battleship on Earth would not die in a duel of guns. It would die under a storm of wings. Orders went out to the American carrier decks. Engines roared, propellers spun, and within minutes the sky above the Pacific thundered to life. Wave after wave of aircraft lifted from steel runways, Corsairs, Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers, hundreds of them climbing into the clouds. Their mission was simple: erase Yamato from existence. Shortly after 10 a.m., Yamato's radar operators reported multiple contacts, fast, high, and closing. The first American scouts had found them. The captain ordered all hands to battle stations. Sirens wailed through the corridors as sailors raced to their posts. Ammunition hoists clanged, watertight doors slammed shut, and the ship began zigzagging at flank speed, its great hull carving white scars across the sea. At 12:30, the sky darkened with shapes. The Americans had arrived. To the men on deck, the horizon seemed alive. Dozens, then hundreds of aircraft weaving in and out of the clouds like predators scenting blood. They came in from every direction, coordinated and precise. Yamato's gunners opened fire. The ship's 18-inch main guns, designed to destroy enemy warships, now pointed skyward, firing massive anti-air shells that burst into blazing spheres of metal fragments. The roar was deafening, the air filled with smoke, flame and shrapnel. But the planes kept coming. Dive bombers screamed down from the clouds, releasing 1,000-pound bombs that fell like meteors. Torpedo bombers skimmed the waves, closing in from port and starboard simultaneously, braving the torrent of flak erupting from Yamato's decks. At 12:41, the first bomb hit, shattering one of the anti-aircraft platforms and killing everyone on it. A second struck near the aft turret, blasting open the deck. The ship shuddered violently. Moments later, a torpedo slammed into her port side, flooding forward compartments and throwing men off their feet. Yet the ship refused to die. Damage control teams sealed hatches, pumps roared to life, and counter-flooding began to keep her upright. Smoke poured from the vents, but Yamato still held speed. Her guns kept firing, her crew still fought. Then came the second wave. At 1:20 p.m., another formation of American aircraft descended from the clouds, precise and relentless. Torpedoes churned white wakes across the sea. The American pilots had been ordered to concentrate all strikes on one side, overwhelming the ship's balance. Within minutes, multiple torpedoes smashed into Yamato's port hull, tearing open her armour below the waterline. Flooding spread uncontrollably through the lower decks. Men drowned where they stood, trapped behind sealed bulkheads. On the bridge, Captain Aruga watched the list increase. 5 degrees, then 10. Pumps strained against the flooding, but the sea poured in, faster than they could fight it. To stabilize the ship, he gave an impossible order: flood the starboard engine rooms to counterbalance the list. 300 men obeyed, sealing themselves inside as seawater rushed through the vents. The balance was restored, for a time, but at the cost of their lives. By 1:30, flames engulfed the superstructure. The ship's great pagoda mast burned like a torch. The third wave arrived minutes later. Dive bombers from Yorktown and Intrepid plunged through the smoke, their bombs smashing into the bridge, the forward deck and the gun turrets. Another cluster of torpedoes struck amidships, tearing open compartments that had already been weakened. Yamato slowed, her bow sinking deeper into the sea. Still, the anti-aircraft gunners fought on. Some continued firing even as the water reached their knees. Others refused to leave their guns until the end. The sky was chaos. Flaming aircraft plunging into the ocean, tracer fire arcing in every direction, black smoke blotting out the sun. American pilots later said it was like attacking a volcano. Yet for all her fury, Yamato was dying. Her great heart, 12 roaring boilers, was failing one by one as the engine rooms flooded. Communication lines went dead. The ship could no longer steer. At 2 p.m., the list passed 15 degrees. Admiral Ito sent his final message to the escorting ships: abort the mission, return to Japan. The operation was over. On the bridge, Captain Aruga removed his cap and tied himself to the railing. He would not leave his post. Below decks, hundreds of men gathered in prayer. Others stood silently waiting for the sea to claim them. At 2:20, the forward magazines began to heat. Flames spread through the ammunition stores. The roar deepened to a monstrous growl as the ocean itself seemed to tremble. Then, at 2:23 p.m., Yamato ceased to exist. The explosion tore through the ship with the force of a volcanic eruption, shattering the hull and sending a column of fire and smoke 20,000 feet into the sky. Witnesses aboard American aircraft said it looked like a small atomic blast. The shockwave rattled planes miles away. When the smoke cleared, only a boiling patch of sea remained, littered with debris and burning oil. Out of a crew of 3,332, barely 270 survived. The rest went down with their ship. In less than 2 hours, the most powerful battleship in history had been erased by air power alone. The Yahagi and several destroyers shared her fate. The survivors drifted in oil-slicked water, surrounded by the echo of explosions fading into silence. The sun hung low, turning the sea blood-red. For centuries, Japan had tied its identity to the sea, to mastery of the waves. Now that sea had taken its most sacred creation. The Yamato was gone, and with her the last illusion that steel and courage could stand against the age of the machine. When the thunder faded over the East China Sea, the age of the battleship ended in smoke. The sinking of Yamato was more than the destruction of a warship, it was the death of an idea. Japan's greatest vessel, the symbol of its imperial might, had vanished beneath the waves in less than 2 hours. In Tokyo, the news struck like a silent earthquake. Official bulletins spoke of heroism, of sailors fighting against impossible odds to protect the homeland, but everyone understood what it truly meant. The last hope of the Imperial Navy had gone down with her. No more fleets waited in harbour. No secret weapons remained. The ocean that had once carried Japan's empire now reflected its defeat. Survivors of the battle were hauled from the oil-black water by the few destroyers that escaped the slaughter. Some clung to floating debris for hours, burned and half-blind from the flash of the explosion. Among them was a young radar officer named Mitsuru Yoshida, who would later describe those final moments not as combat, but as a requiem. He remembered looking back and seeing where Yamato had been, only an inferno, a rising column of flame where the pride of a nation had once sailed. For the men who lived, the silence afterward was unbearable. They had been trained to die with their ship. Instead, they were condemned to remember it. When American reconnaissance planes returned over the wreck site hours later, they saw nothing but a vast oil slick stretching across the sea. The water still boiled in places, as if the ocean itself refused to calm. The final tally was devastating. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors lost, while the attackers suffered the loss of barely a dozen men. It was the most lopsided naval engagement in history, a clash that marked the moment when industrial air power fully eclipsed the great guns of the sea. For the Americans, the sinking of Yamato confirmed what the past 3 years had already shown. Air supremacy ruled the oceans. Battleships were relics, no matter how massive their guns or thick their armour. Aircraft carriers, with their reach and flexibility, had replaced them as the true capital ships of modern warfare. To the Japanese High Command, however, the loss carried a deeper humiliation. Yamato had been more than a weapon. It was a cultural symbol, a living metaphor for the empire itself. Her destruction was a funeral for an entire worldview. As the battle for Okinawa raged on, American commanders reflected on what Yamato's final sortie revealed. Admiral Chester Nimitz later wrote that the Japanese Navy had chosen to die with honour rather than live with reason. The sacrifice achieved nothing militarily, but it exposed something terrifying. If Japan was willing to send its greatest ship and 3,000 men on a mission they knew would fail, what would they do when the Americans landed on their home soil? Operation Tengo became a warning, a grim preview of the fanatic resistance that would meet any invasion of Japan itself. In Washington, military planners studying the reports concluded that an amphibious assault might cost millions of lives. That calculation would echo through the corridors of power in the months to come. Meanwhile, the Pacific War pressed on. 4 months after Yamato's destruction, atomic fire consumed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered unconditionally soon after. In the ashes of defeat, the wreck of Yamato became both legend and ghost, a monument to engineering brilliance and strategic blindness. Divers who later found the wreck in the 1980s discovered her lying in 2 colossal pieces, 340 metres beneath the sea, her bow section inverted, her shattered turrets still pointing toward the surface as though defying the heavens. The men who went down with her remain entombed there, preserved in silence. Japan declared the site a war grave, never to be disturbed. In the decades that followed, Yamato's story transcended war. For some, she symbolized the ultimate futility of pride. For others, she embodied craftsmanship and devotion to duty taken to its tragic extreme. The ship became a cultural mirror in which Japan confronted both its genius and its guilt. Artists, writers, and filmmakers reimagined her story again and again. In 1974, an animated series resurrected her as Space Battleship Yamato, a science fiction epic where the sunken warship was reborn as a vessel of salvation, carrying humanity's last hope to the stars. The fantasy of redemption through sacrifice resonated deeply with a generation searching for meaning after the war. Decades later, the live-action film Yamato retold her final voyage through the eyes of those who served aboard, turning their hopeless mission into a national elegy. At Kura, where she had been built in secret, the Yamato Museum opened 60 years after her death. Inside stands a perfect 1/10 scale model of the ship, towering, immaculate, gleaming under spotlights. Around it, exhibits trace her creation from blueprints to destruction, filled with the artifacts and faces of those who built and sailed her. Visitors walk the decks in reverent silence, reading the names of the 3,000 who never returned. For them, Yamato's not just a warship, it is a lesson carved in steel about the price of hubris and the limits of courage. Historians still debate her meaning. Some call her the pinnacle of battleship design, the finest machine of her kind ever constructed. Others see her as a monument to waste, a colossal misdirection of resources that could have built dozens of destroyers or carriers instead. Both are true. She was the greatest of her breed, and the last. Her guns, the largest ever mounted on a ship, fired only a handful of times in anger. Her armour, the thickest ever forged, failed to save her. Her engines drove her forward into a future that had already left her behind. Yamato was both masterpiece and anachronism, a giant doomed not by enemies but by history itself. For the pilots who destroyed her, the moment carried little triumph. In their after-action reports, they described the engagement with professionalism, not pride. To them, Yamato had been another target, large, dangerous, but inevitable. Some wrote home about the explosion, about the sight of a mountain of steel splitting apart beneath their wings. Few celebrated. They had done their duty in a war where duty had long since eclipsed glory. And yet, the memory of that battle endures, not as victory or defeat, but as transformation. The sea that swallowed Yamato became the grave of the battleship age. From its depths rose a new kind of warfare, one fought through the sky, through machines that conquered distance instead of armour. The lesson was absolute. Power unadapted becomes ruin. The ship that had been designed to outgun everything on the ocean had fallen to forces it could never even reach. Today, somewhere beneath the waves of the East China Sea, Yamato rests in eternal darkness. The currents sweep across her shattered decks, whispering through the empty corridors where thousands once stood. Her guns are silent, her flag long gone, but her story endures, retold in museums, in books, in films, in memory. She was both triumph and tragedy, brilliance and blindness, the final echo of a vanished world. The water above her is calm now, smooth as glass, as if the ocean itself has chosen to forget. But history remembers. It remembers the roar of her guns, the courage of her crew, the fire that consumed her, and the truth her death revealed, that no empire, no ideal, no machine, no matter how mighty, can defy the future forever. The Yamato sleeps beneath the sea, eternal witness to the moment when human pride met the sky and lost.